You're thinking about someone who has left. Not necessarily gone from your life. Perhaps he's still there, somewhere, in a more distant circle, in a silence that has settled over you. But gone, as people leave when something closes between them. And in your heart, since his departure, there's something like an unanswered question. A presence in absence. A burden that time hasn't quite dissolved. Sometimes you wonder what he's thinking, what she's feeling. Whether this person who left, or who let everything fall apart without holding on, thinks about you as much as you think about her. Or whether you still exist in her mind, now that you're no longer present in her visible life. Perhaps weeks have passed, perhaps months. Perhaps you've tried everything to move on, filled your time, met friends, convinced yourself that things would get better, and perhaps in some ways they will. But the question remains. Silent. At night, or in those quiet moments of the day when the noise fades and something inside you keeps returning to the same place. Tonight, I will reveal to you what Carl Jung understood about what really goes on in the mind of someone who has left a deep connection, and why what you perceive, without being able to prove it, is much closer to the truth than you think. Carl Jung, one of the greatest explorers of the human soul the world has ever seen, never studied love as a mere feeling. He considered it a psychic event, something that occurs in the deepest layers of human being and leaves traces in the unconscious, long after the visible surface has changed, long after decisions have been made and distances created. And Jung observed something that contradicts conventional logic. He found that it is almost never the person who is left behind who suffers the most from absence. It is always the one who leaves. The central theme tonight is the shadow. One sentence is enough to understand it. According to Jung, the shadow is the part of ourselves that we have not yet integrated. Everything we repress, everything we deny, everything we flee from within ourselves and project onto the world until it returns to us in one way or another. And the one who leaves carries something in their shadow that they cannot yet confront. Something that has everything to do with you. Jung observed that the breaking of a deep connection, when one person decides to leave, to distance themselves, to let something die between them, does not have the effect that conscious logic expects. Conscious logic says, you leave, therefore you free yourself. You create distance, therefore you create space. You decide not to be there anymore, therefore you don't have to think about it anymore. However, the unconscious mind does not operate according to this logic. According to Jung's theory, a deep connection doesn't break the moment someone decides to leave. It continues to exist in the unconscious of both partners, regardless of what visible reality dictates. And for the one who has decided to leave, for the one who has actively separated something, this connection lives on in a particularly charged psychic sphere. Because in the unconscious, one doesn't truly leave behind what one has experienced deeply. One merely relocates it to a place where it can no longer be directly perceived. And this step comes at a price. That's what most people don't understand about the dynamics of a launch. That's the part nobody tells you because it's counterintuitive and unsettling. Leaving someone you truly loved, or with whom you shared a deep connection, doesn't liberate the unconscious. It burdens it, because the unconscious doesn't distinguish between conscious decisions and deep feelings. And when those deep feelings contradict conscious decisions, when one part of you wanted to stay while another wanted to leave, this contradiction doesn't disappear with distance. It takes root. It deepens. It begins to exert its influence. And this work often takes place at night, in dreams. In those moments when the ego's defense mechanisms weaken and the repressed comes to the surface, not in a pleasant way, not in a chosen way, but in a real and intrusive way. Perhaps you recognize this from other situations. The people you left behind, whom you thought about more often after their departure than before. The situations you fled from, which caught up with you, precisely because you had fled from them. It's the shadow at work. What you haven't dealt with always returns in one form or another. And deep down inside, you already knew it. Your soul knew it. Not your mind, which develops arguments and defense strategies. But deep inside, something had grasped that this person's absence wasn't as simple as it seemed. That behind the distance, behind a facade of ease or familiar routine, something else existed. Something less free, less decisive, less certain than appearances suggested. You perceived something real. And here lies the paradox with which Jung confronts us tonight. To truly connect with someone means never really leaving them. One sentence. Let it in. To truly connect with someone means never really leaving them. This seems to contradict everything that ordinary logic dictates. If someone has left, they are gone. If someone has decided to no longer exist, this decision should produce a clear and unambiguous reality: absence, freedom, oblivion. Yet according to Jung's theory, in a profound connection, precisely the opposite occurs. And this is for the following reason. The human unconscious does not view the conscious decision to leave as a psychological closure. It evaluates connections based on their depth, their impact on the inner structure, and the changes they have brought about in self-understanding. And a connection that has touched something essential, a connection that has awakened parts of the self, brought long-suppressed desires to light, and made visible something one would rather not see. This connection does not end with the farewell. It penetrates into deeper layers, and there it continues to have an effect. What the person who has left feels, even if they never express it, even if they don't admit it to themselves, is a kind of persistent presence, not always conscious, not always pleasant, often disguised as something else, as restlessness, as excessive novelty, as a lightness that seems more constructed than felt, like someone walking too fast to hear the noise of their own thoughts. Jung observed that the intensity of avoidance after a separation is proportional to the intensity of what remains in the unconscious. The more someone feels the need to appear liberated, fill the emptiness, and prove that everything is all right, the more present and charged with what they are fleeing from becomes. And you, who witnessed this farewell, may have noticed something similar. A superficiality that becomes excessive. A life that fills up too quickly, too intensely, too conspicuously. As if every new activity, every new presence in her life were merely a way to avoid thinking about something specific. This specific something is often yourself. Now I would like to guide you through the phases that someone goes through who has severed a deep connection, not as a list of signs to be interpreted, but as the real movement of a soul facing what it wanted to leave behind. I call the first phase deceptive clarity. This is the phase immediately after departure, the phase in which, for the person who has left, everything seems to confirm that it was the right decision. Relief. A feeling of lightness, a feeling of newfound freedom, or rather of released tensions, which resembles freedom but is not quite the same. This clarity is real, but incomplete. It arises from the resolution of conscious tensions, tensions in the relationship, expectations, conflicts, or unspoken problems. But it doesn't yet reflect what's happening in the deeper layers, which haven't yet had time to process what has transpired. In real life, this phase resembles someone who resumes their activities with renewed energy, speaks decisively with friends, and seems convinced of their decision. Perhaps you perceived it that way too and thought, they're really doing well. They don't seem to be giving it any thought. But this clarity, however genuine it may seem, is only the most superficial phase of the process. It is not the last. I call the second phase the return of the ghosts. The deceptive clarity lasts for varying lengths of time. Then something changes. Distractions lose their power. The noise temporarily subsides. And in these moments of silence, in the morning upon waking, in the evening before falling asleep, on an ordinary journey where nothing demands attention, something returns, not necessarily your face or your name, sometimes a song, sometimes a street, sometimes the way someone laughs, reminding you of something without you knowing exactly what. The unconscious doesn't always return directly. It returns through association, through resonance, through those subterranean connections that Jung called the memory traces of lived experience. And in such moments, something tenses up, something resembling regret, not necessarily formulated as such, not necessarily recognized as such, but existing as a special quality in the silence. I call the third phase silent reinterpretation. This is the phase in which the unconscious begins its real work. In the weeks, sometimes months after the farewell, the deceased relives the story, not consciously, not systematically, or in an orderly fashion, but fragmentarily, at night, involuntarily. Scenes return, conversations return, moments return, and they return differently than they were originally experienced. Moments you carried around like wounds, he may now see as moments when you tried to tell him something he wasn't ready for. Moments when he felt your affection and rejected it because it shook something deep within him. He now sees them with a new clarity, a clarity that allowed for distance and prevented closeness. And in this quiet reinterpretation, something changes in the way he perceives you internally. You become something else in his unconscious. Less the source of tension, more the person through whom something essential has become visible. I call the fourth phase the truth of the night. This is the most difficult phase for the person who has left, and the least visible to you. It's the moment when the silent confrontation with the issue becomes so profound that it can no longer be dismissed by everyday life and its distractions. When something, unpleasant, unintentional, forces its way into those areas the ego cannot control. Dreams are often the most important medium during this phase. Jung observed that the unconscious speaks most clearly in dreams, in those spaces where the ego's censorship eases and repressed material resurfaces symbolically or sometimes very directly. And in the dreams of the one who has passed, you likely exist. Not necessarily in romantic or idealized scenes, in scenes that bear the emotional burden of the unresolved, scenes of conversations, intimacy, or sometimes conflict, but scenes in which your presence is real and vivid. When he or she awakens from these dreams, something remains, a feeling that doesn't belong to morning, that seems to come from elsewhere. And in this liminal space between dream and waking, what he or she truly feels for you exists, unprotected, unreflective, without the distance the ego has created. This is what you haven't been able to see until now. But it exists. I call the fifth phase the threshold of intrinsic return. This is the phase everyone is waiting for, but few truly understand. This phase doesn't always manifest as a visible return. It doesn't always appear as a message, a sudden appearance, or the resumption of direct contact. It initially presents itself as an inner return, a shift in the unconscious's orientation, a silent movement deep within in which something turns back toward you. And you perceive it, not always explainable, sometimes intuitively, as the feeling that something has changed in the space between you, even without anything concrete having happened. Sometimes as synchronicity, in the Jungian sense. That meaningful coincidence that isn't one, that moment when something in the outside world seems to react to something in your inner world. The question is, what do you do with this moment? And that's precisely where I need to tell you something essential. But Jung would add the following, and it is precisely this part that most people avoid. What you expected, analyzed, and hoped for during this breakup, the attention you paid to the other person's signals, the energy you invested in interpreting their feelings or lack thereof, all of that has its value. But all of that also comes at a price, And that price is one you will pay. Because that's precisely what Jung would have emphasized in your situation. While your attention was focused on the other person, while you were wondering what they were thinking, what they were feeling, whether they would come back, a part of your own inner work remained unused. Part of your own transformation was put on hold, dependent on the return or non-return of an external person. And it is precisely this uncertainty that is the real question this farewell raises. Not, is he or she thinking of me? But, what do I think of myself if I no longer define myself through this connection? Who are you without this expectation? What do you truly desire for your life, regardless of what this person does with theirs? What part of you has been silently waiting for you to stop tying it to an external reward so that it can finally truly exist? Because that is precisely where the real work lies behind the scenes in this situation. Ignoring the other person's signals, but recognizing what their departure has revealed about one's own relationship to one's own worth, one's own loneliness, and one's ability to fully belong to oneself, even if a loved one has decided to leave. It's not easy to confront. It's the part we often prefer to avoid by continuing to focus on the other person. But precisely this part, if you engage with it, will give you something that neither their return nor their absence ever can. She will give you yourself. And that is what I would like to convey to you now in the silence of these last words. What you've felt since that departure is real. The longing is real. The question is real. And what you perceive, this continued presence of that person in a space that ordinary logic cannot explain, is not an illusion created by desire. According to Jung, deep connections don't end with parting. They change their form. They migrate to invisible realms. And in these realms, they continue to exist, to have an effect, to search for a solution, for you, and most likely for him as well. You're not wrong if you think he or she is thinking of you. You're not wrong if you feel that things aren't over yet. But the most important question you can ask yourself tonight isn't, when will he or she come back? The question is, who will I be in the meantime? Because the person you will be at the end of this journey, more complete, more aware of your worth, more able to love from a state of abundance rather than a state of lack, that person is the only true reward that lies entirely in your hands. You're not waiting. You're building something. And even if you don't see it clearly yet, something inside you knows that this building process has begun. Those who leave reflect. Those who stay grow. And ultimately, growth always determines what happens next. Just tell me in the comments, do you still think about someone who has passed away? And do you feel deep down that this story isn't really over yet? One word is enough. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Share this video with someone who is silently grieving their loss and hasn't fully come to terms with it yet. I've read every message. Take care.